Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is episode 26. And if this is the first time you're here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well. And
Mm,
so this week we're going to change things up where you're going to be
yep.
bringing on a topic.
Yes, please. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about the idea of globalization. And I've been doing a lot of research about it and trying to wrap my head around the concept of it because it seems to be something that I find that people here in the 21st century seem to take for granted as this kind of mode of being, um, especially in a capitalist kind of society. That just comes naturally, right? So like as people progress and technology changes, I guess the world just becomes a smaller place and we all become so interconnected internationally. And globalization is this kind of this force of nature or force unto itself. That like I said, it would evolve over time
Mm.
and seems like a natural progression of the way that the world will simply work. But globalization, from what I can understand, has got nothing to do with that. And the globalization that we know today, the way that the world economy runs, global supply chains, the fact that, if for people living in Australia, if it's not the season for apples, you can get an apple anytime because maybe it comes from America. So you got fresh produce, let's say, that comes from the other side of the world, or if you're in China and you want some milk from Australia, it comes to you and it's still fresh
Mm.
by the time it gets there. Like that concept of globalization, which I think everyone just takes for granted today, especially after the turn of the new millennium, so
Mm.
especially going into the 21st century, um, it's heavily contrived. And I don't think people appreciate that or take the time to acknowledge it if they do understand that it's contrived.
Well, I would agree with you on that point, if we were talking pre-pandemic. So if we were talking about 2019 before that,
Mm,
because really when people think of globalization, um, they think of technology, they think of, I guess, innovation, basically the stuff that has been positives in people's lives.
hmm hmm
But what they probably don't consider is, for their fancy phone that they have in their hand, um, the chips that are in it are done by one country.
mm.
The framing of it is done by another country,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and and I guess the reason why I bring up, I would agree with you pre-pandemic compared to during or post-pandemic is that, well, really the pandemic kind of exposed that because you have all the
Right.
different parts in all of these different
Yeah,
countries, if the entire world shuts down because of a
yeah.
killer virus,
Mm.
then suddenly globalization becomes unviable.
Right, right. And yes, the global supply chain is rather delicate. It's not this robust system like that has evolved and like it's filled in certain gaps and it knows how to protect itself against externalities and
Mm.
grievances and such like that. It really is contrived and very delicately. Like a prime example of the, I guess you would say, pre-COVID world, then in terms of the the scale and the sheer intricacy of globalization is a car that is manufactured by the multinational company Ford. Okay, so Ford is obviously it's an American car dealer and company, so it's very US focused in its operation, and I guess its marketing campaign, especially to US nationals.
Mm.
So if you buy a car, a Ford in LA, let's say, or Texas. The car that you're driving has come together with from 30,000 different pieces that has been made in over 2,000 different locations
Mm.
in 60 different countries with, multiple different companies that come together to make that. So like the 2,000
Wow.
companies plus that are like, making all the parts, the 30,000 parts that come together to make a Ford car, they might overlap some of them in terms of, there's some parent companies maybe and they all feed each other. But think about that. That's 60 different countries that are working in a supply chain to bring together a Ford vehicle. Now
Wow.
that Ford vehicle is made, or let's say put together with those 30,000 parts made, from 60 different countries in inner China somewhere, then floated down the river to Shanghai, where,
Mm.
for like, let's say it takes about 3 weeks to get down the river. Then it sits in port for another couple of weeks, then takes
Mm.
6 weeks to get shipped over to LA. From LA, it's then driven to the dealership. You're looking at about 3 months there before you get the car from when it was put together back in China, if you're getting it straight away.
Mm.
And like you're looking at and this is a vehicle that's got 30,000 pieces in it, and you have a disruption to one part in the supply chain there, and the vehicle doesn't get made. Like at the moment in Australia, I'm not sure about where else in the world, but I've heard people talking that, oh, you want to buy a new car, ha ha ha. Like you might as well, you've got to wait 6 months. You got to
Mm.
order it. Like this is not, we're not in lockdown anymore. I think that people believe anyway that we've come out of the pandemic, but the aftershock of the impact to globalization's, I guess, very fragile framework is still with us. Like if you want to get some furniture, like good luck. You can order a new lounge or a bed or a dinner table if you like. But like it's not like it was pre 2019 where you walk into the shop and they've got it for you or they'll have it for you next week. Like you've got to wait. You've got to wait months potentially for that thing
Mm.
to come. And so globalization has been the story of instant gratification for a
Yes.
long time as the world has become smaller, and especially telecommunications technology has increased, I guess, the rapidity of how we access things and like how efficiently we can coordinate
Yeah.
different systems. Then like we've got amazingly intense at perfecting what the Japanese created called the just-in-time system.
Mm.
And so, like the old capitalist way of doing things was like, okay, let's say you manufacture something or, yeah, let's say you manufacture a good or something like that. You would invest in the products to make that thing, and then you would produce the good, but you would have the product itself, the end product, and the raw materials that you need to make it all stored in certain places, and you'd keep
Mm.
supplies for yourself, just in case times got tough or there were interruptions to supply chains and all that sort of stuff. And so you could keep your business running even in tough times. Now,
Mm.
that type of capitalism is gone. It
Yeah.
does not exist anymore. And like we were talking about, the Ford dealer as an example, the Ford car as an example, everything is literally just in time. So like
Mm.
all the parts that come together that need to be made to put the engine together all come from like, 30 different companies in 10 different countries. And they all must come together within like, a few days or the same day of each other so they can put the
Mm.
engine together in the right time to get that into the chassis and then all the other things that need to come together. So like globalization has been able to run on this incredibly intricate and like timed to perfection system,
Mm.
which has been completely disrupted. And COVID, I think it's a really good example that you've used that the global pandemic has shown us that this type of system can only work in a world where globalization, like true globalization as we've known it, is available. And I
Mm,
would say that the globalization that we know is we've 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 reached its peak and we have surpassed it. It's gone now. And I
mm,
don't know if things will ever be the same. And I don't know if people fully understand that yet. People do believe or like live in this hope of, okay, yeah, fine, I can't buy a car at the moment. It's going to take 6 months, 12 months to get that car or that piece of furniture or this product from the other side of the world.
mm.
Whatever, things will get back to normal. But like that understanding of how the world was global like that
Yeah.
is not normal. And it's a very, we've lived through a very unique time in history from the end of World War II to basically 2019. And I think the glory days are over.
Well, you don't even have to take the pandemic into consideration of this kind of globalization being almost a house of cards, because the other incident that springs to mind that kind of shows that it really is a house of cards is, okay, I completely forget the name of the barge,
Mm.
but
Is it
obviously,
like the Evergreen or whatever it's called?
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, the super tankers and
yeah,
the enormous cargo ships that we
mm,
have um, in the world today. And like that is right there. Like globalization, we were talking about the intricacies of like, getting things to getting you that fresh produce from the other side of the world, getting you your car that's made from so many different parts from so many different countries. That's that's the end product. The
mm,
logistics of it. That's the other real factor here that I think is completely contrived, as I was saying before, and people just don't realize it. The idea that you could have like this super container ship, right? Like
mm,
the Evergreen. This thing is like it's just the 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 peak of globalization surmised in like in a container ship. It is just like ridiculously massive. The amount of stuff it can hold in its hull and still be able to travel at like a certain distance at a certain pace kind of thing is just incredible. And I don't think, yeah, it's the peak of like global logistics right there.
mm,
And so the world turns on the global supply chain that is fed by global shipping. And global shipping has, after World War II, been able to advance to a certain point only because of security.
mm,
Okay, so you can have these massive cargo ships, right? That can literally like float at a snail pace around the world, like dropping off things as they go at the major ports in major kind of strategic locations. In Singapore as they go through to India, and then from India they go through the Gulf, they go off into like Europe and stuff like that, and from Europe they might go across to the Americas, and then like they follow this kind of route as they circulate around the world, dropping goods off and picking them up as they go along. But they go at very slow paces um, because it's more economic
mm,
for them to do that, because if they're just enormous and they carry all of this stuff, they technically take less fuel than two ships that would do the same or three ships that would do the same. So they get bigger and bigger and bigger, more bulky and more kind of just ridiculous, and they
mm,
carry more and more stuff. But as soon as there's an interruption, bang, like that one, like that story you were talking about, like there's like one ship that like basically got stuck and held things up, and like the world was spinning, like the
mm,
whole, like everyone was talking about it. Like you wouldn't think that like one cargo ship full of like your standard containers was going to interrupt the entire planet,
mm.
but it had that effect. And that is a great case in point for what I'm talking about here. But really, let's just put aside the logistics of these floating vessels moving slowly around and basically distributing all the things that makes the world go
Yes.
round. The thing that allows them to move so slowly and be so big is the fact that let's just call it this, it's arguable for many factors, but for the point of this discussion, let's just call it global security.
Yeah.
It's safe to travel in the oceans as a shipping container or
Yeah.
a tanker carrying oil. Before World War II, that never existed. There were things called pirates before that. I'm not saying there's not pirates now. Pirates exist. But like thanks to, and like I use the word, thank you, very, very lightly here, but thanks to US imperialism, basically, and the enormous reach of their navy and the power of their military, they've been able to secure the seas
Hmm.
for the global supply chain. And that's the only thing that's keeping people going. Like
Yes.
really, honestly, that's the only thing that is keeping people going. Because if, for an example, right,
Yeah.
it only takes apparently one of these tankers to go down, like someone to just be like, I'll take that. Like an army with a country with a navy that has like just nabs them when they get near their port or near their shores. And like the amount of insurance that rides on these container ships, that it just takes one of them to go down, and there's no insurer in the world that's large enough really to cover the loss of one of these ships. Like they might be able to
Really.
just cover one, but like if one ship goes down, all the other insurers will bail out and they'll be like, well, sorry, we can't do this anymore because it's just going to cost too much money for us as an insurer to try and cover this. And so it only takes one of
Really.
these cargo ships, yeah, basically to go down to be snatched by someone for the whole global supply chain to just falter right there because no one will ever want to cover it because it's just way too risky. And so
Yeah.
in a world where you have no global security, right, the Americans basically patrolling the oceans, that funny joke from the creators of South Park, the America, the World Police kind of
Hmm.
that movie. I can't remember what it was called. Um,
What, Team America?
Team America. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Yeah. Like there's a lot of legitimacy to that ideal that they are the world police, right? And they patrol the oceans and stuff like that. So globalization pins on the security that comes from the ever watchful eye
Hmm.
of Uncle Sam. Now, I'm not suggesting that they do this altruistically um, at all.
Hmm.
You know, they've set up the global supply chain, I think, to fuel their own business interests
Hmm.
primarily. But like you'll have people that will argue that they did it after World War II, kind of as a promise to the Allies that
Yeah.
like, you know, they would look after the world and like keep everything safe so they could keep everyone's economies going and then Europe could rebuild after World War II and like they could then use their power to open up and make everything safe and like around like the developing world as well
Hmm.
so people could move goods around and the global economy would just work. So that's like the nice like American style tale that they tell all the kids in schools and stuff like that about how globalization came about. That like the Americans just were really nice, and so they decided that they'd help everyone out because they were such benevolent rulers of the
Hmm.
world that they were just going to help everyone out, so we could all trade nicely and get along and make money. But really, what had happened at the end of World War II was you had in Europe, with the fall of the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany, you had Soviet Russia, a, you know, what's the word for it? A, a let's just call them a communist nation
Yeah.
versus, you know, your capitalist allies. But like in Europe, because of the anti-fascist movement, right? All of the anti-fascist fighters that were across there actually fighting the Germans in like, you know, Italy and France and all of the periphery nations of the West, of
Hmm.
Eastern Europe, sorry, they were associated strongly with communist parties.
Yeah.
Okay. very strongly associated with communist parties. And so the Americans saw this. So then when they went in to save Europe kind of thing, but really it was mostly done by Russia, the anti-fascists within those countries, and the Americans kind of just swept in at the end and kind of took over. They promised the Allies at that point, they said, look, we will help fund the restoration of Europe. Um, Send us your gold and we'll send you money to build and kickstart your economies and stuff like that. On the one condition though, that if you're doing this, if you're going to set up, your liberal democracies and all that sort of stuff, you got to get rid of your communist
Mm.
parties. And communist parties were banned across Europe and England and all that sort of stuff up to where they divided Germany into east and west. So the Soviets and the communists had this half, and like the rest of the world was left to America. And America kind of at this point could have established an empire because they had all the means, and Europe was just an absolute wasteland. But they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to have to impose themselves and have a military on the other side of the Atlantic and have to feed that system. What they did was they got people addicted to them and tied to them financially.
Mm.
And so Europe was indebted to the Americans, and everything worked off this idea that let's start trade up and we'll look after the oceans for you and make sure that everything's safe enough. You just can't, you must stop the spread of communism
Mm.
so we can keep our capitalist interests, our business interests at large. And then the world started to develop around that model. And
Yes.
that's where globalization comes from. It's got nothing to do with this natural progression of business and capitalism just being this natural way of doing things that humans gravitate to, and it just solves all the world's problems, etc., 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 because of the invisible hand of the market, and it's the
Mm.
most equal distribution of goods and services and all that sort of stuff. It was completely contrived because the Americans basically they had all of the power. They were just undisputedly the dominant power in the West at that
Mm.
time, and they were undisputedly the economic powerhouse of the world. 50% of global GDP existed in America at the end of World
Mm.
War II. And so they had to maintain that structure. And you don't do that by creating and expanding a physical empire where you actually got soldiers stationed all around the world, because the military expenses are way too much. But if you can get them basically addicted to you or dependent on you for economic reasons, which is what they did to Europe and Japan, so the major industrial nations of the world at that
Mm.
time, bar Russia or bar the Soviets, if you got all of them playing along to your tune and singing to your rules and regulations kind of thing, you can literally control the world economy from there. And from that point, American-led businesses and corporations from those advanced industrial nations would then go on to create the neoliberal type of policies and world,
Mm.
basically raping and pillaging and looting the developing or the third world from there on, using this global supply chain that we've been talking about. So globalization, you can look at it as this lovely thing that delivers you your iPhone and your goods from the other side of the world,
Mm.
but it's also a system which allows the most advanced and developed countries to basically
Mm.
exploit the entire planet
Y-
and
Yeah.
take its resources and get things moving globally and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty good point to also talk about how, yeah, I guess globalization kind of assumes that all of the necessary parts within a value chain are working and are going to be working in perpetuity. Because I'll use a term to kind of show what I'm kind of talking about here. So a very common accounting standard is the idea of a going concern within an organization. And what a going concern is, hey, you've been existing as a company for the last 10 years. You've been doing well this year, so we're going to assume that at the end of this current financial year, you are going to continue as a business. Now, the reason why I bring that up is that globalization, and when you have these kind of value chains, they kind of just assume that everything is going to be functioning like a well-oiled machine, and there are going to be absolutely no problems. So pandemic is one example of this. Evergreen is another example of this. There's even a more recent example of this, but maybe in a different vein. And that's obviously everything that's been happening in Ukraine.
Right.
So,
Yes.
so what's interesting about Ukraine is, at least with other stuff we've been talking about, logistics, or if there has been a physical breakdown of the globalization system, then there's problems that proliferate, if you will. But what's interesting about Ukraine is, well, obviously everything was happening with there between Ukraine and Russia. The EU as well as America think it's a good idea to place sanctions on Russia with certain things, but whether you think whether they thought it through properly or not, but what ends up happening from that, from a globalization perspective, is that a major source of the world's oil is actually from Russia.
Yeah.
So what they end up doing is they place sanctions back on the EU as well as America, and they are quite successful in finding other buyers of their oil. And you end up with a situation, for example, in the UK, where working families have to decide on whether they want to keep the heater on in winter or keep the lights on. And whilst people might focus on like the logistics of Evergreen getting caught in a canal, these kind of globalization also affect different aspects economically within a system.
Yeah.
And because there is no supply anymore with oil, suddenly interest rates skyrocket in the EU as well as in America. Families find out that they have to make significant choices within their working lives. And, well, there's a lot of collateral damage. And
Yeah.
I guess that can show that globalization as a concept can be a house of cards if, well, you kind of mess with the system.
Yeah. And I think that it's a really good point that you're saying about, like, because of the delicate nature, sorry, of globalization, we are experiencing, I think, across the world, a rise in inflation, and it's becoming a very big political and social issue for a lot of developed countries, if not like just the world generally. Everyone's feeling the crunch of some hardcore inflationary problems. And a lot of that has got to do with failures in the global supply chain. As you've been saying, like, things have been getting dearer, and like Ukraine is a great example because, a lot of Western Europe gets all of their gas from the important pipeline that runs from Russia through the Ukraine and services Europe. Russia is a massive exporter of crude oil. And so, like, taking them out of the supply chain and putting sanctions on them for the West, yeah, maybe they've found some alternate buyers and things like that, but it takes a massive chunk of the oil supply chain from the world. Like, America is in a very unique position because of, like, I guess you could say the shale revolution. So that's fracking. And all that type of stuff. It changed the game about how you can get access to natural gas and oil. And so, like, America, from having like this kind of need to dominate the global like oil supply chain, and like being stationed in the Arab nations all the time, has kind of let go of that. a lot because, or like is slowly edging away from its commitments to a lot of these things because it can supply itself in terms of oil. And like whether you like it or not, there's a lot of discussion nowadays about like green technologies and the green revolution and all this sort of stuff. But the entire world is addicted to oil. There's no getting around that in any, and there's no easy way to say that to people. People always, I think there's this sentiment at the moment we're on the edge of like, kicking oil, and, greenhouse gases or carbon emissions and all that sort of stuff. And we're just about to, jump into this new, brave new world, of sustainable energy sources. But like it's got so far to go and
Mm,
there's so much that can go wrong like before that would ever happen that like it's almost basically a hope and a prayer. And
mm,
like because the world is so dependent on oil, like basically unless you've got your own supply of it, if the global supply chain was ever to go down, then like if you're, yeah, like I said, if you're a nation that doesn't have access to its own oil slash and can refine that oil, then you're completely at the whim of the global market. And if people can't get to you because you're so remote or your ports are, you have to cross some dangerous area where there really are pirates or rival navies that will intercept like trade ships and oil tankers and things like that, your whole country overnight well, basically, like, don't worry about just turning the lights on and off. Like, there won't be electricity anymore, and no one will be able to move in your country. That's your whole logistic supply chain internally gone. No more trucks,
mm,
no more cars moving. Yeah, no more electricity, no more nothing, no more food. If you can't move things around, you can't feed people. And so, like, the end of globalization, if we still keep to see these like these world events, let's call them, that
mm,
like spark off some crazy kind of impacts to the movement of goods and services around the world, and they ricochet around, bouncing off things and destroying things as they go. We start to see more and more of these events starting to compound. Like the ramifications of what we're talking about here are absolutely astronomical and like potentially
mm,
world-ending kind of stuff. And that's before you even get into kind of like the maths of it all from a very, very fundamental perspective if you just look at people by the numbers.
mm,
So, like, let's have a look at like one of the fundamental kind of principles of globalization or ideals of globalization is you have like as the world kind of globalizes and develops and stuff like that, we kind of see that like population trends just keep kind of going up and up. It's like very usual for us to have these predictions where we just see, okay, we're at, what is it, 7 billion people this year. In like, 10 years, we're going to be 8 billion people. Another 10, we're going to be 9. And like we just have this kind of upwards trend. And you were saying before in accounting, everything is kind of based on this idea that everything will perpetuate kind
mm,
of forever in perpetuity. Like, but demographically, right? There was no time like after the world wars, let's say. Like people were kind of devastated after that, but economic growth went up and people
mm,
were starting to industrialize more heavily. The developed nations that were already industrialized were getting wealthier. And then the countries that were kind of on the periphery of that then started to develop and got into the industrial system. And like people started generating a nice bit of income for themselves, but they were having children.
mm,
That's the main thing. The baby boomers are called the baby boomers because of that purpose. Like, they boomed and then they had lots of kids and all that sort of stuff. But like in order for like globalization to continue and the way that the world economy works to continue, because everything is based on consumers. That's like the most basic way of doing things. So you want to sell stuff to the world, you need people that are going to buy it.
mm,
And you need people that have capital accumulated enough to invest in the things to make that stuff so other people can buy it. And so, since the baby boomer generations and the generations that followed them, people have been having less and less kids. And so,
mm,
like, you think, yeah, that might be a problem for someone like Japan or maybe like some of the more industrialized European nations like Germany and things like that. But it's not going to happen everywhere. But like, if you look at demographics by the numbers, and like you look at like kind of access to resources and like good geographical strategic locations, there's probably about like a handful of countries in the world that might be actually demographically sustainable moving in to the next 20 to 30 years. And like
Yeah.
we've reached globally like a point of no return, right? So if you look at the global population, okay, most of the people like in the world are aging. And it's not just like they're aging and they're not being replaced at the bottom, and we've got like a little bit of time to figure it out because they're still in the workforce. The largest part of the aging population is in their 60s at the moment. And
Right.
like in your 60s is your age of retirement. So the world is about to shift gear basically from like the people that actually from like your 20s to your 40s, let's say, or your let's say like your 40s to your 60s, you're actually quite an important vehicle in the global economy because you've gone through your 20s and your 30s, potentially you've had your kids and you got rid of them, but you've also accumulated capital and you've got experience. So you get paid more than you did when you're in your 20s and 30s, but you've also invested and you've got your own assets and stuff like that. So you can leverage your cash a bit more. But like when you're in your 20s and 30s, you might be starting out in your career and you're starting a family. So you're consuming a lot, but you don't have a lot of disposable cash. But once you get into your 40s and your 60s, you've got disposable cash. So like there's consumer and kind of money flow going on there and feeding that whole global economy. But like at the moment, we're about to go through a mass wave of retirement almost like globally. There's a few countries that really aren't going to do this exactly because like they're going to have the mass retirement. Don't get me wrong, the baby boomers and the generation that just followed them kind of thing are about to retire. But like some countries do have the population coming underneath them to kind of replenish that or stabilize that. But most of the countries in the world do not have that. Most countries in the world are aging and they're at the age bracket where they're all about to mass retire. And as soon as these people mass retire, they're not contributing to the economy anymore. They're actually feeding off it because most of them will be getting pensions or
Mm.
dipping into their retirement funds. And so they go from like this class with a lot of capital that makes the world go round to a completely dependent class of people. And that is going to have absolutely astronomical and like unfathomable impacts on the global economy. It's already starting to happen, but over the next 10 to 20 years, this is going to have like an absolutely game-changing effect on like how the global economy works. And like most countries won't be able to support themselves. And so like it's either going to revolutionize the way we do things like in terms of workforces, because there's just not going to be enough people around to do the work. There's a lot of struggle in, I think, developed countries at the moment, post pandemic, where people are talking about like, oh, there's just not enough people out there to work, and there's just not enough, like, you can't find good people these days, and like, everyone blames the millennials and the Gen Xers and the Ys and all this sort of stuff, and says, oh, they're just useless, like they just don't want to get out there and work, but like, there's just not enough of them. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
they may be pathetic. You can complain about that if you want, but like it's not like they're just piking out and staying at home and playing Xbox. There's literally not enough of them
Right.
to kind of replace the amounts of in the workforce that we used to have.
Yeah, yeah, which is more to your point is that if that demand to match the supply,
Mm,
if that's growing exponentially,
mm.
then what the baby boomers had to deal with compared to what the millennials have to do now, it's a different ball game.
It's a massively different ball game, and there's
Yeah.
pretty much like America. Like if you look at like good demographics, like I said before, coupled with good resources and geographical location and stuff like that, it's pretty much like America, France, and New Zealand, which are countries that don't have the curve kind of thing. They actually have more of a straight line or like an actual pyramid where like the millennial generation is large enough to feed the retiring baby boomer generation. And so like that's a handful of countries that can supply themselves with their own resources kind of thing and don't have a population that's about to kind of implode on itself. Pretty much all other countries, where they might have some good demographics and they might have some contingency and stuff like that, everyone else is pretty much about to go into a mass retirement phase. And like that's gonna like put significant strain on their economies. And then if global consumer demand like just bottoms out in the world that we're currently living in at the moment, which is like this post-pandemic world that we've been talking about, where like global supply chains have completely been disrupted anyway, it's going to be very, very difficult for the global supply chain to continue as is, because if there's no demand for the goods and services and stuff like that, everything goes. Like in the physical realm, everything goes. Like the one part, I guess, of the global economy that just keeps on kicking on, and we've talked about this and criticized it a lot, is like the financial market, the speculative financial market. Like, because, you know, everybody needs shares, right? Like they'll put food on the table. So yeah, demographically speaking, the human race is at an incredible turning point right now. And if you have countries like, if you have a country like America, who's kind of been, you know, the world police, the benevolent ruler of the world who's just been there to look after everyone, and they're starting to withdraw because they're losing interest in certain affairs. Like there's big question marks at the moment as to why, if Ukraine is so important to like global politics and like Europe and like just the way that the world functions generally, why haven't like someone like the Americans, who are pretty bloody trigger happy, let's be honest, why haven't they just gone in there like kind of thing, guns blazing with NATO and the rest of the European Union, and just like sorted this thing out? You have to ask that question. Like, why hasn't this happened already? If this is so integral, and we haven't seen any like kind of crazy nuclear end of the world stuff that they were kind of predicting when all of this started happening. But like if Ukraine goes down, like let's just say Russia actually takes Ukraine here, like the chances of nuclear war like goes from like here to like here, like immediately, because like Russia doesn't stop at Ukraine. Russia's trying to basically wipe out their kind of the gateway into Russia from Europe. And that includes then taking Poland and like all of those other kind of periphery kind of Eastern European nations that were traditionally on, you know, Russia's payroll at various times over the last, you know, so many centuries. This has always been a tactic in the Russian playbook, is like, you know, eat up those nations, Ukraine especially, and make sure you have some buffer room. So if the rest of the Europeans and the Western Europeans especially get like, you know, too aggressive and trigger happy themselves, you've got some buffer room so they can't go straight into Russia. And so like the question has to be asked, like, why, when the Americans have been pretty trigger happy to go into other people's countries, like, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, like all of the South American nations, like, you know, all of the Asian region, like Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, like they've been pretty trigger happy when they've wanted to justify, you know, spreading freedom and democracy kind of thing. Why aren't they spreading a bit of democracy in Ukraine right now? There's a massive disinterest, it would seem, from the Americans. They're pulling out of the world police role. And if they are honestly pulling out of certain things, and you can see them retracting from stuff slowly in their foreign policy, a lot of their policies since Trump, and like this is the funny thing, like everyone's just like, Trump, Trump, naughty, naughty, evil, evil. But like Biden's foreign policy regime has been not only like to continue with Trump's like, you know, sanctions and tariffs and trade war kind of stuff, it's actually been to hamper down on it. He's increased it more. He's done more Trump things than Trump has, realistically. And so the Americans are really tightening up their borders at the moment. And like if they're about to tighten up their borders and like stop, policing the world's oceans, and you have these demographic shifts that are coming and disruptions to the supply chain that are just happening as a day-to-day occurrence. The world we know is potentially on a knife's edge at the moment for IS.
Well, yes, that's definitely the case, and it's not just the northern hemisphere that things have been I guess uh, diplomatically tensions have been increasing. Even in our neck of the woods in Australia, things have not been the best because I guess everything with AUKUS hasn't exactly been we've been pissing off China, which is probably not a good thing to be doing. So I guess a quick recap of what I've been saying is our previous Prime Minister Scott Morrison, he tore up the subs deal with France with Macron, and he ended up doing a nuclear subs deal with the US. And obviously, China hasn't necessarily. Well, actually, there's two players in this. China hasn't been particularly impressed with us because obviously that sends them a red flag of what our intentions are in terms of um, uh, our borders and also what signals we're kind of sending towards them.
Our
But also,
geopolitical interests, it's
yes,
massive.
there's not only that, but also the other one is Indonesia is not particularly impressed with us because
Mm.
that puts them square in the middle of two countries posturing against each other, and uh, yeah, I don't think. Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm not an ambassador of Indonesia, but I'm pretty confident if China, uh, dis, if China is threatened by us
Mm.
and wants to go through Indonesian waters, I don't think that they would put up too much of a fight, or at least they don't want to put up a fight with Australia if they want
Mm.
to go through their domestic waters.
Mm.
So look, I'm blazing over a lot here, but uh, basically a breakdown of globalization value chains. It's not just happening in the northern hemisphere. There's the threat of it even here in the southern hemisphere.
Mm. Mm. And like when it comes to the AUKUS and like the submarine issue, the nuclear subs, it seems to be this massive like talking point here in Australia. I don't know if it's even getting off our shores and people are even hearing of it. Like I know the French would have heard of it at the time that we tore up their contracts kind of thing and got rid of the French nuclear subs for American nuclear subs and all that sort of stuff. But like there's the strategic alignment there is quite obvious, isn't it?
Hmm.
Because like you have nuclear subs with supposedly weapons grade like uranium in them,
Hmm.
which like according to Australian treaty anyway, you can't have nuclear grade weaponry or nuclear grade uranium. Sorry, weapons grade uranium in this country anyway. We're
Yeah.
one of those countries that you're not supposed to do that in. I'm pretty sure. So, like, the fact of the matter of having these nuclear subs already is very questionable why they would be stationed in this country. And, like, let's just make this massive assumption here then that it's going to be because the Americans probably want to have a station in Southeast Asia
Hmm.
where they can put nuclear missiles, basically, to face them directly at mainland China.
Yeah, but also, look, I could be misquoting this, but I'm
Mm.
pretty confident there's a famous Chinese saying that it's like you kill the chicken to show the monkey. It's something like that, where I
Mm.
think the point of the saying is that um, whenever you have an alliance, you go after the weak link to show the higher ups that you're serious.
Mm.
And I guess
Mm.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that um, by doing that sort of posturing,
Mm,
which threatens China,
mm,
we're putting them in. They're putting us in their scopes.
mm.
Because you know
Right.
they wouldn't go after America first. They'd
Well,
go.
let me put your mind at ease then a little bit for IS. And I'm working on a video on this at the moment, actually. It's going to
Okay.
come out soon. But like we're going to talk about global supply chains, globalization, and resource management. Let's look at China. Now, China supposedly has a population of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah.
Now, closer estimates have been happening on that over the last couple of years, and they think that they have potentially overstated their population a little bit.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, so let's just put them at about 1.2 billion people as a
Okay.
conservative measure. The demographics of China, because of the one child policy, right, has put them in like one of these crazy demographic curves where by 2050, they will have, drum roll please, 50% of the population that they have today.
What?
But if you just look at demographics, like demographic charts and stuff like that, by
Right.
2050, China will have, if we go off like 1.2, let's be generous, they'll have probably about 800 million people left by
Hmm.
2050. That is a significant reduction in a population number. And they are an aging society. And they are, by like global standards and by world history standards, they are now the most rapidly aging country the world has ever experienced. And this is because they've had rapid urbanization and the one child policy has kicked in. And like they've kind of played around, let's say, with the way things have been going for themselves demographically. They've tried to warp their numbers by, like having certain policies going on, but it's completely, I guess you would say, in a medium-term sense, has shot themselves in the foot demographically, and they won't be able to soon in the same way we're talking about lots of other countries be able to replenish themselves from a demographics perspective. They're on the cusp of a mass retirement themselves as well. People are starting
Hmm.
to age there and go into retirement, and the kids aren't there to replace them. The other
Right.
thing about China is that, like, let's just say all this kind of nonsense goes on with like the World War III scare and the,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
China versus America or World War III kind of stuff. Let's
Yeah.
just say it goes there. Now, while China kind of supplies the world with like all of its goods in terms of like its manufacturing, and its like chemical supplies and like all these type of exports, it only has all of those exports because of all of the things that it imports. China is the one of the like the largest consumer bases because of its population and its manufacturing power in the world. So basically, it gets most of its stuff brought into the country, processes it, and then sends it back out again. So
Right.
China is not independent by any stretch of the imagination. And let's go look at like the thing that goes and makes the world go around. And I'm not talking about money, that does make the world go around, but the other thing that
Yeah.
fuels the world then, oil. China
Yes.
relies on a lot of other countries for its resourcing. Like, look at how dependent China has been on Australia for just getting iron ore
Hmm.
and like fueling its coal fire power stations, right?
Hmm.
Like it's completely, or it's almost completely um, resource dependent to exist. And that's just to make the country work. Then all this stuff that it does, like from a manufacturing perspective, like all of the technology that comes out of China, all of the goods that come out of China and things like that, like it doesn't develop the technology in its industry on its own. Like all of its factories that are pumping out like all of these goods, they all come from Germany. Germany are
Hmm.
the high tech kind of masters of the universe that supply all of the like the Chinese factories with all the high tech robots and automation and all that type of stuff that it uses in all of its factories to pump out all of the goods that the world feeds off. So then, like, if you look at all the microchips, then they go into all the products that they feed to the entire planet. That all comes from Taiwan or South Korea or Japan.
Mm.
So, like, there's nothing really like China is kind of the hub of import export, like consumer markets around the world. Everyone pumps stuff into China and then takes stuff out of it. But China doesn't look after itself sustainably or
Mm.
independently. And it's got some massive problems in itself in terms of its own, sorry, politics. Like the CCP is struggling internally
Mm.
with, trying to, like, let's just say it nicely, trying to control certain different ethnic groups within its borders and things like that. It's struggling, it struggled with Hong Kong for a while. It's struggling with Taiwan. Now,
Mm.
like everyone's like talking about, oh, let's do a simulation of what, an invasion of Taiwan will look like, and they're worried about like China, using the South China Sea to launch an invasion and start World War III. But like Taiwan is like literally offshore for China. Like it is so close to China's border. It is China. And like, why aren't they able, if they have such military prowess, able to just be like, thank you, I'll take that, please.
Mm.
China doesn't have like, and this is like, we're talking like from a military perspective, it doesn't have a long range navy. It has a navy, it has an army, but it doesn't have, in terms of like, it doesn't have the naval power required to launch proper assaults on external enemies, like people that aren't holding a border with it. And so, like, if China doesn't have the ability to take Taiwan, I think it's a really good test case for the rest of the world. And if it's not resource dependent, right, and it can't supply itself, it's a really good indication for most people out there whether or not they're going to do things that are going to screw themselves over, like economically. Because, like, if they really, like, look at what happened to Russia when Ukraine happened. China's been watching that situation very closely, and
Mm.
they're not ready to have the world put sanctions on them out of some warped sense of morality that comes out of multinational corporations when they decide whether or not to do business in a certain country. But they're not going to risk the type of sanctions that happened in Russia because at least Russia's got some level of independence when it comes to its resources and all that sort of
Mm.
stuff. Its demographics are screwed also, let me just tell you. But like China is completely screwed if it gets cut out of the global supply chain. And it's got a
Mm.
lot of people to feed. And like those people, like 30 years ago, were all living in the country and feeding themselves. Over the last 30
Yeah.
years, they've all moved into the city. They can't feed themselves anymore.
Yeah.
If China gets cut out of the global supply chain, like they can't feed themselves. They've got some big things to surmount before they even think about starting World War III. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit to put your mind at ease. If anyone's turning in their beds right now thinking that Xi Jinping's going to be knocking on the front door, just just put a few things in perspective because they don't talk about this type of stuff in the media. And I think they do that on purpose because, like, you know, since the Cold War finished, we need another boogeyman to heck, right?
Mm.
To keep the
Mm.
population in check for IS,
Yes.
and that's China.
Right. Okay. Well, you know what? That's probably a good point to end the podcast on.
Mm.
Just as a final thing, as we usually do around here, one, this week's synthwave art was based on the prompt "globalization taking over the world," and for some reason, it did an alien invasion.
Yeah, I thought that's what I was looking at. Interesting.
That's number one. And number two, if you guys don't already know, Mystery and myself are performing at Red Alert 2023 on the 6th of the 5th, uh, 2023. Yes, but there's been a venue change. We're not at the Highway End Mall anymore. We're now at the Argencourt Hotel, near UTS. But yeah, just wanted to let you know that uh there's been an update to the venue. So yes, the early bird tickets are running out, so grab your tickets. And yeah, with that, that's the end for this week. Remember, guys, to keep thinking and keep learning. And for the sign off, I'll give it to you, Mr. A.
Thank you very much, 4AS, and to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.